The story of Insurgency is one you've probably heard before. A small group of developers piece together a simple but technically proficient mod and throw it on Steam, where it gains a somewhat cult classic-like following. Years later, that mod, Insurgency Modern Infantry Combat, releases as its own standalone title in 2014, simply named Insurgency, and that small development team became New World Interactive, a tactical, semi-realistic multiplayer FPS emphasizing objectives, atmosphere, and immersion. Insurgency rose from cult classic status to become not only a good game in its own right, but among the very best of its genre. 4 years and over 5 million copies sold later, time came for a follow-up to New World Interactive's 2014 hit. That follow-up is Insurgency Sandstorm. Sandstorm has positioned itself to be far more than a worthwhile follow-up to Insurgency. Through detailed gameplay and structural tweaks, New World Interactive has once again produced a must-own for fans of the genre. Weaknesses, which certainly exist, do little to dampen Sandstorm's overall quality and experience. Slightly janky vaulting animations and somewhat disappointing character customization among the biggest culprits. Sandstorm's customization isn't so much an issue because there's not enough. I don't really have a problem with the collection of options Sandstorm gives players. Instead, my biggest issue is with the frequency of credits, points you obtain playing the game and redeem for cosmetics. Currently, you get 100 credits per rank as well as one random cosmetic item. The higher your rank, the longer it takes to reach the next rank. Items cost anywhere between 100 and 1,000 credits. At the beginning, credits come pretty quickly and it's fun changing and customizing your character in between matches. But eventually, you'll get to a point that ranking up takes a long time and the nice stream of credits you were accumulating slows to a crawl. New World Interactive hasn't said anything definitive, but I wouldn't be surprised to learn Sandstorm's economy was designed this way to facilitate microtransactions. I said this in my beta impressions video, and I think it's worth repeating. I believe the business model of microtransactions is complex. New World Interactive is a small developer backed by a small publisher making a game in a niche genre. If microtransactions help support and sustain their business, keep people in jobs, and keep work on Sandstorm going, then I'm fine with that. If Sandstorm were backed by a corporate titan and had a $70 million budget, this conversation would be different, but they aren't. So while I'm okay with microtransactions existing in this context, I still don't think 100 credits per rank is an adequate pace, as it's made cosmetics almost an afterthought, whereas hours earlier I was constantly looking forward to changing the look of my characters. Optimization is a little tedious too. It took me about an hour of flipping through graphical settings before I got Sandstorm running smoothly, and there are still some moments I noticed precipitous frame drops. New World Interactive switched from Source to Unreal 4 for Sandstorm, and outside those occasional hiccups, it looks and runs fine. Problems aside, Sandstorm still impresses. It builds on the foundation Insurgency laid, but still keeps its quasi-realistic feel, taking recognizable mechanics and executing them near AAA levels. Heavily objective-based, Sandstorm prioritizes communication and teamwork. All three modes, standard multiplayer, ranked competitive, and co-op, revolve around your standard capture an area objective type, with a few other objectives mixed in. Rather than respawning on individual timers that vary by player, your entire team respawns in waves, of which your team has a limited number. The time in between these waves can get long too, sometimes lasting more than 30 seconds. Depending on the game type, capturing objectives sometimes nicks the respawn timer altogether. It's relatively standard stuff, at least from a game type perspective. Sandstorm's modes are likely pretty similar to other multiplayer games you've played before. At the beginning of a match, you select your class, choose what weapons and equipment you'll be using, and go on your way. Each class has its own job and role to fill. The Demolitions class, for example, is the only class with rocket launchers, making them important in combating enemy vehicles, while Gunners carry light machine guns used to suppress enemies, hold down flanks, and provide covering fire. For those who'd rather be versatile than specialized, Rifleman is your class, containing a diverse assortment of weapons and attachments that fit a variety of scenarios. Inside these classes are more layers of give and take. Equipment costs points, so giving your character, say, more armor means you may not be able to carry as many grenades or give your weapon as many attachments, and you may not even prefer to spend all these points. The more equipment your character carries, the heavier they get. More equipment means your character sprints slower and increases weapon sway, so it's best to vary playstyles from class to class. Riflemen don't need tons of equipment to be effective, but if you play as a gunner, loaded with heavy weapons and tons of ammo, you'll be better fit setting your weapon up and covering streets and flanks, rather than rushing to engage the the enemy. I wouldn't go so far as to call Sandstorm class-based. I don't get the impression Sandstorm's classes were designed to necessarily lean on one another. The Advisor class, for example, is essentially a different version of Rifleman with a different collection of weapons and attachments. Advisors don't necessarily have a specific role to fill. Breachers have weapons like shotguns and SMGs that are useful for clearing rooms, but the other classes clear rooms just fine. Your team's success is based more on people just playing the objective, and less on if every member of your team is perfectly filling their role, though that'll definitely help. Besides Riflemen, teams can only have so many specialized classes on the field at once, so I'd recommend creating a few different Rifleman classes that will make do during those times you may not be able to nab your preferred class. The only drivable vehicle in Sandstorm is a truck with a machine gun in the bed. It's not the strongest vehicle, but when used correctly, it's extremely effective, and can provide those who may not have a more specific role with a job to do. Without a doubt, the two classes that make the biggest difference between victory and defeat are Commander and Observer. Commanders use binoculars to call in artillery strikes, smoke cover, and other abilities. Both teams, the Insurgents and Security Forces, have their own call-ins that emphasize different strategies. Security Forces have helicopters that'll hover above the map for a few minutes, forcing enemies to stay inside, while Insurgents have chemical mortars that can infuse buildings with toxic gas. Insurgents can equip a gas mask for free, which will protect them from the chemical mortars, while Security Forces are charged a point to equip one. These call-ins are limited, meaning commanders can only call in each support a few times per game. For commanders, it's essential to learn the maps and keep in tune with the flow of a battle. Knowing where and when to order support is just as crucial as playing the objective. Calling an artillery strike on the objective to hold off an enemy attack is useful, but it'll also keep teammates outside the objective from getting in. The Apache attack helicopter and Black Hawk gunship give Security Forces a massive advantage for a few minutes, but call them in too early and they won't be around if you need them later on. In order for a commander's call-ins to go through, an observer needs to be within a few meters to actually radio them in. Gameplay-wise, observers don't actually have to do anything but stay close to commanders. The calls for support automatically go through, cited by some really cool radio chatter.
I want explosive mortars over there!
Outpost! We need explosive mortars here, quickly! Are you ready to fire?
Okay, sounds good. Firing explosive mortars.
So, beside being aware of the commander's position, observers also need to stay in cover. If an observer dies in the middle of calling in support, the call will cut short and terminate. This dynamic between commander and observer, again, isn't an unfamiliar mechanic, but it's one that Sandstorm executes effectively and makes important. For those interested in Sandstorm's ranked competitive mode, the classes change up, reducing to 3 classes that emphasize infantry-to-infantry combat. There are no commanders or observers. While I see the allure to Sandstorm's infantry-based competitive mode, I much prefer the game as it's fully fleshed out, with commanders, observers, and vehicles. Sandstorm's maps might represent the largest departure from Insurgency. They're larger, more detailed, and complex. These maps contain areas of impressively dense urban cities and more open areas that facilitate longer-range engagements. Many of Insurgency's maps were structurally similar to Counter-Strike, filled with lanes that led to funnels and flashpoints where heavy firefights took place. Sandstorm's density and size changes that up. There are still areas with choke points, but Sandstorm doesn't emphasize them as much. Instead, these maps are multi-pathed, packed full of explorable buildings, alleyways, and streets. These changes are great and make battles more organic, less predictable. Currently, Sandstorm has just 6 maps. Their size and playing maps in reverse, changing the scenery and objectives, helps keep them fresh and away from feeling overplayed, though it would be nice to see more. One change I'd really like to see is Sandstorm's objective placement. On a few maps, the objectives take shape as a specific floor of a building or small room. For example, on Hideout, one objective is the first floor of a 2-story building. The floor itself has 2 rooms, and you have to be inside one of these 2 rooms in order to attack or defend the point. But if you look around the building, there's all kinds of cover and alternate routes surrounding it. Squeezing the objective in that spot limits how you can use the surrounding terrain. Firefights become teams taking turns tossing grenades and making suicide runs through a couple doors. It turns the multiplayer from a battle for a building into a battle for a room, which isn't as exciting or dynamic. Sandstorm is at its best when it utilizes the versatility of its larger, wider maps. This is also true for Sandstorm's co-op mode, which gets a little repetitive as your team takes the same objectives. It would really extend the co-op's replayability if maps had multiple places for the same objective, and you never really knew which one was going to activate. The AI is a good challenge. They're dangerous in firefights and at times can be really unpredictable. Teamwork matters as much in co-op as it does in multiplayer. I'd like to see not just more maps, but ones that are a little more distinct too. Sandstorm's implied Middle Eastern setting is fine, but a few maps blur together, especially when you first start playing. Like any other good multiplayer game, it just takes time to learn the lay of the land. Though I will say the variety and creativity New World Interactive put into Insurgency's maps would be a welcome addition to Sandstorm. The ambience Insurgency is known for, Sandstorm once again makes strides. Audio quality is among the best I have ever heard in a game. Weapons make distinct enough sounds to pick out in firefights. Footsteps, character voices, opening doors, and moving through grass and brush are loud enough to notice. You can hear other players sprinting from about 20 meters away. Get close enough and you'll pick up enemy voices. This all adds an element of auditory awareness to Sandstorm that Insurgency never really had. Crouching and moving slowly through buildings will help you sneak up on enemies, while loud sound effects like explosions and helicopters provide audio cover that'll mask your movements. Outside of gameplay perspective, the audio is just great. It's crisp, clear, and deafening. Of course, as I said in my beta impressions video, Sandstorm's excellent audio is better heard than described.
Ah, Christ!
Three down. Seven down.
Weapons have undergone a change as well. Accuracy and recoil are a bit harsher in Sandstorm. There's a tangible weight to weapons. Mechanically, I wouldn't describe it as simulation, but firing weapons definitely feels closer to Arma or even Postscriptum than it does Insurgency. It's a change I really like. I've found myself playing Sandstorm more slowly than I played Insurgency, turning corners with my weapon drawn. The only issue I've come across with Sandstorm's gunplay is occasional really odd lag. It's tough to tell if this is due to poor latency I experienced at the time or an actual problem with the game itself. Bullets sometimes seem to hit their target late, almost a second after I fired the shot. It doesn't happen enough to ruin my experience, but when it does happen, it's noticeable and frustrating. In addition to how weapons feel, reloading has been tweaked too. Unlike a lot of shooters, your ammo count isn't a pool of bullets, but individual magazines. If you reload a half-empty magazine, it'll go back into your magazine pouch, saved for later. Its bullets won't be added to other magazines. Being that ammo is limited, even with a few ways to pick up extra, conservation becomes important. Pressing R saves a magazine, placing it back in your inventory. However, if you'd rather get rid of a magazine that's almost empty, double tapping R quick reloads your weapon. A different animation that's a bit faster where your character drops the old magazine. The only way to check your remaining ammo is to hold R, showing how many magazines you have left as well as the remaining ammo in your current magazine. Doing all this, checking ammo and reloading, takes a few seconds, leaving you defenseless. Like Sandstorm's audio quality adds an element of awareness to gameplay, reloading does too. You'll need to remain conscious of the best times to check your ammo and reload. Sandstorm's reloading adds a touch of pacing to the intense multiplayer. Matches weave between sequences of intense firefights and into slower, quieter moments used to check ammo, reload, and reposition. The reloading animations themselves are phenomenal. Taking the time to watch just how methodically detailed New World Interactive got crafting your character's hands interacting with triggers and bolts won't disappoint. Paired with its sound work, Sandstorm's reloading animations make for, again, among the best I've ever seen in a game. I'm going to give Sandstorm a B. It's both a must-own for fans of the genre, and because it's not as complex as a simulator, it's a great entry point for new fans. At a retail price of $29.99, Sandstorm is a steal, a visceral, auditory, and visual multiplayer slugfest that's tons of fun. If Insurgency is any indication, Sandstorm is poised to be one of the very best semi-realistic tactical shooters on the market for years to come.